So this is module 2, and today we're going to talk about the preseason activities. We're going to talk about the plowing aspect of game day, and then we'll wrap up by talking kind of briefly about some things to think about after each storm in the season. And so that's sort of our game plan for today. So I won't repeat the commercial. I think everybody's heard it, but again, I will say that, you know, as T-squared centers, and some of you are from other states joining us, so, you know, you've got them in your state too. We're all a little bit different, but, you know, by all means, reach out to us if there's training or technical assistance that we can help you with, because that's why we're here. So again, I'm Matt Carter. I'll be today's instructor, and I'm the engineering circuit rider for the Delaware T2 Center. And, you know, my background's there. And most of where I cut my teeth with winter maintenance, snow and ice fighting was when I was public works director with Cecil County, Maryland. And that was primarily Cecil County's roads, which are about 630 miles of roadway, are predominantly rural. And so that plays into it in terms of sort of what my experience is, and your experiences might be a little bit differently, and should always feel free to weigh in a little bit. We are going to be recording today's session on the Zoom platform. When I thought about recording, I thought of music. And so for extra credit, if anybody recognizes the band for the end of the session, put it in the chat box or pipe in, and you get extra credit. It's a little bit of an obscure one. So just again, the quick tips on Zoom for those of you not familiar with it. You should have a panel down at the bottom of your screen that you might have to scroll, you know, bring your cursor down to reveal, but it'll have mute and unmute and start and stop video, and the other things. You'll see the chat box there, and so we will, you know, we'll use these various things a little bit. We will do a couple of polls. We're not sort of poll crazy, but we'll just have a couple of those throughout, and you'll see those. We encourage you to participate in those as we go. And again, you know, as we go along, absolutely feel free to drop stuff in the chat box. You can also use these cute little reactions if you want to. And questions are good. Questions or thoughts, or, I mean, particularly, you know, again, you know, my experience is what it is, right? And I you know, supplement that with a lot of sort of academic knowledge from various research studies and other things that have been put out, but it's, you know, it's not comprehensive, and you may very well have, you know, some different experiences, or you may have tried some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. And if it doesn't ring true, ring the alarm, right? Let's talk about it a little bit, because we find in this course, you know, this is our first time doing it virtually this year, but when we do it in person, we get a lot of good interaction, and sometimes that's very constructive. So I think most of you did this last time, but if you could indulge me anyway, let's go ahead and try out the chat pod. If you could put into the chat pod your name, agency, the state where your agency is, since some of you are from outside of Delaware. And if you want to put a funny comment in there, you're welcome to do it, right? It's a nice casual crowd. So if you can just drop that in when you get a chance. And so, again, most of you are familiar with this. You know, so last time we sort of did an introduction to a lot of different concepts that we're going to build off of from in this session. And we talked a lot about sort of the planning process, if, you know, whether you're developing a formal snow and ice control plan, or whether you were just going through the thought processes, the brainstorming process, the evaluation process to improve what you do going forward, building off of what your experience has been. So that's what we did in module 1 today. Again, we're going to talk about that preseason and post-storm activity, and in between that, our game day focus today will be on plowing. Now, in our last module, module 3, later this week, we're going to talk about various de-icing strategies and materials, be it chemicals or sands or what have you. And then we're going to wrap up with postseason activities as well. And again, we drew off of, a lot of materials for this. You'll see, I want to remind you that you'll see reference to a lot of these materials in the lower left of slides. Sandy has posted a link to the slides in the chat box. So, you'll see some actual links on those slides if you download them that you can click on, and will take you to various things. So we've tried to connect you with these resources in a lot of different ways because they were integral to the development of these materials. So let's talk first about this first phase. We'll just talk about preseason readiness, right? So, hopefully all of you are still in the preseason. If, there may be a person or two on the call that's already seen some kind of a storm. I know that, up north, I've heard some rumblings of some storms already. We've so far not seen anything here yet. So we still think of ourselves here in Delaware as preseason, but there's a lot of things that we really ought to be doing. And again, it goes back to what I talked about in module 1. I talked about this notion of controllable versus uncontrollable factors, right? And it's the controllable factors that we want to focus on. And so if we get in a jam during a storm in December or January, and it's related back to something we didn't prepare for, then, it's at that point that we really can't have a beef with the public when they hammer us. They hammer us with a lot of different stuff, right? And they're pretty unfair with us sometimes. But if it's the kind of thing that resulted from us just not planning, then they at least have some kind of point, even if they could be a little nicer about it. So we want to talk about some of the things that we really ought to be either thinking about or doing in the preseason. So we'll go through that. So this is the first. I think there's only 2 poll questions in this module. So this is the first one. And let's put this up and I'll launch it. And if you guys could weigh in and tell us where you are in terms of target readiness. Do you have a target readiness date for getting things ready? If you could click on that and let us know. All right, we're getting them in. With a small group, you always hope for 100%. But I think that Sandy and Rusty can't vote, so we might be already there. So, there we go. Just another second. Okay, I'm gonna share that out. So, yeah. So I mean, these are, again, there's not a right answer to this. But this sort of leads into something I want to talk about that. And probably early to mid-November is probably pretty common in my experience in terms of where people target and would like to be ready. Again, here in Delaware, we usually don't get much, we don't usually get anything to sneeze at before then. But just 3 or 4 years ago, we did get a storm on Halloween. So it was a small storm, but it caught us all unaware, and nobody harped on us too badly because that was certainly an unusual event. So I'll come back to that a little bit. So, again, in the last module, we talked about all that planning, thought process, et cetera, that maybe we did this year, maybe we haven't done for a couple of years, whatever, but we've got some kind of plan in mind. And now it's time to put the first pieces of that into place. And if we wait until too late in the season, we're gonna regret it. So during this preseason period, however you define it in your area. Again, there are opportunities for whether it's conferences or training or what have you geared at snow and ice, classroom training. Well, not really classroom training, but virtual classroom training like today. Some training videos, which again, I'm going to link you up with today. Some that I think that I really think you could find useful. This is a great time to, if you do tailgate safety meetings, which we hope you do, it's a great time to pivot towards some of those that are really geared towards winter maintenance activities and the particular safety challenges that can come with that, slip, trips, and falls, 3 points of, contact, getting in and out of equipment, things like that. Mentoring, the newer folks to our organization, sometimes gets overlooked. Those of us that have been doing it for a long time, we just sort of take it for granted perhaps, and we kind of have forgotten what it's like to be the new person to the organization that doesn't know how this works, or maybe they were at another agency, but they don't know our peculiarities or how we operate or whatever. So some of that mentoring and peer training is good. And if you get the chance to do some dark hours training during this period, it's a really, really good idea if you can squeeze it in. Not all agencies can, but the value of it is that most of us are pretty used to seeing our routes during the daytime, but we don't get very much opportunity to see it at night when a lot of the visual cues can disappear on us. It can make a real difference if we can sort of orient ourselves to what that's like in less visible conditions. If this time of year, if there's chances to, get around and see some equipment, other people's equipment, see our own equipment, make sure we know what's available to us. Snowplow rodeos. So here in Delaware, the local insurance trust that represents about half the municipalities in Delaware is going to be doing a snowplow rodeo that Sandy and Rusty and I are going to assist with them once again. That's a great opportunity to sort of, blow the dust off of some of the muscle memory that maybe we've forgotten since last year. It's during this time that we ought to go back. Again, we talked about some of this stuff in the planning section. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but this is where we're enacting it, right? And so this is where we should go back with our crews, with our personnel, and sort of review, what are the various workforce rules, labor rules, whatever. Are there new things that our human resources group has let us know about? Are there particular concerns? Do we know that there's going to be some people that have to be out maybe for a surgery in early December or something, or in January, or so it's just a good time to go through the whole collection of personnel stuff, and really go back. Again, this comes back particularly to those folks that are new to our agency, and talk about what we mean by standby duty, on-call duty, things like that. What does that really mean, so that we don't have a communications error and them not realize exactly what their readiness was supposed to be. Going back, again, reminding, which, this is for our community, this is a little bit like reminding people to look both ways before they cross the street. But going back to drug and alcohol stuff and saying, look, it just has no place in this. We've all got to be sharp as tacks, so that we can all be safe and make the road safe. Again, it's this time of year where, nowadays we have real good opportunities to be in touch with each other, unlike the old days where really all we had were landlines back in the day. But by the same token, telephone numbers can change. People get new phones, whatever. So we really ought to each year this time go through and say, update me with your current phone number. Where can I reach you when you're on call, et cetera. There may, again, some agencies have some real difficulties with take-home vehicles, whether it's the dump truck or otherwise. You know, this season, perhaps more than ever, that's something that perhaps you might want to revisit, where, you know, with concerns about COVID, where we sort of want to limit exposure, that might be something to revisit. I'll touch base on some of that a little bit more later on. And again, anything you can do, particularly during dark hours, to do route familiarization or training on new equipment, this is the time of year to do it, because you know, it's coming around to us. I pointed you to this last time. I think everybody was on the call, so I won't belabor it. But again, I would really encourage you to go and view at least some of these videos. Again, you can click right on that link there, and it'll take you. They're all on YouTube, and they're handy and they're pretty brief. So you know, maybe not all of them are relevant to you, but several of them are, and they did a really nice job with it. So I'm going to do this. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. And I'm going to, whoops, make sure that I'm sharing computer sound. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Rusty or Sandy, give me a thumbs up if you can when it starts.
Before it snows, check out your streets. Examine steep hills. Watch out for low-hanging cables, manhole covers, curbs, and other obstacles. Know where you'll encounter parked cars. They double your plowing time. When the storm hits, drive defensively. How you drive will depend on conditions. A country road at midnight will be plowed differently than a city street at rush hour. Unsafe operation can cause serious injury to pedestrians, operators, and passengers. And remember, the equipment you're operating is worth a lot of money. So please drive carefully.
So, you know, again, and that's one of the old videos that we dug up for this course. A guy actually dug that out of his basement for me. You know, a couple of things with that. I mean, again, it reinforces that idea. The more you know your route and understand it intuitively, the better off you're going to be, even in a relatively rural area like that. But you can think about when you're in a more urbanized area, you've got a lot of bridge joints you're crossing that might be raised a little bit. It's nice to know that they're there so that you don't sort of knock a kidney out when you come across it. Manhole covers, you know, curbs that jut out, things of that nature. Again, this is the time of year where, you know, we ought to go through with the crew and make sure that when they show up for duty to fight the storm, that they've got all the gear that they need so that they can stay dry, warm, ready to go. The last thing you need, you know, particularly if it's somebody sort of new to the operation that, you know, maybe doesn't understand the importance of it, you know, shows up and you know, doesn't have warm boots, doesn't have, you know, warm jacket, et cetera. And now they're going to be less effective for us than they would be. Let's see. This is the time of year where we ought to be doing outreach to stakeholders, whether that's our, you know, elected officials, briefing them, the public, any groups we can do. Again, all of us have different avenues. I think what's not here is social media. Not sure really social media existed in its in any real sense when I developed this course, but you can tack that on there as well. You know, and if you remember from module 1, I talked quite a bit about levels of service and expectations. And this is part of how you sort of let the public know what the expectations, the reasonable expectations they can have of you for this particular season in various kinds of storms. So it's part of how you try to win some hearts and minds. If you deal with contractors, again, you know, by now we should have those all under contract and in place, insurance in place, all of those things we should probably have had them bring in their equipment so we can check it out and confirm that they're ready to go. Sort of make sure that their readiness is exactly what our readiness is. You know, we've got to identify routes with them, points of contact, how we're going to communicate, and sort of remind them of what their obligations to us are as well. You know, sometimes agencies will share some equipment with their contractors. That's fine. Again, that coordination needs to take place now so that you make sure that that's all going to function well for them. You know, remind them of where they should be picking up salt or sand or other materials, how they go about using those and controlling them. Establishing with them what our levels of service are for the routes that they're involved with. You know, all of that stuff we need to review with them. That's part of our readiness. This is a real key thing. Again, some of us, you know, particularly with smaller agencies, can still have some fairly unusual material storage issues, whether it's sand or salt. Or whether it's where we've got plows or spreaders or that type of thing. And so, you know, it may very well be that where those materials are placed are also staging areas for other projects that, you know, maybe started back during the summer or something like that. And those may or may not be projects within your control. So this is, you really want to get out ahead of them and say, you know, hey, you've got, you know, guardrail or things like that stacked up in front of the place where I need to get to for our salt or, you know, spreaders or what have you. And, you know, you had told me that, you know, it was going to be gone by November 1st. It's still there. You know, one of the reasons I'm not allowed to talk to the public anymore is that, you know, I probably wouldn't have the tactful way to go at it. My inclination would be to say, you know, at this point, either you guys move that stuff or I'm going to, and you won't like the way I move it. So, you know, it's the point being is that you should probably be more diplomatic than me, but you really need to, you know, up the game and make it clear that we're out of time. We need the access to those materials, and we need to get on that right now. You know, if we haven't done it before, we need to take good inventory. You know, if we're just now looking at, you know, material stockpiles, we're cutting it pretty close probably in terms of delivery times of things, but better late than never. So we should get a look at what those material stockpiles are. Do we have what we've planned to have? Again, we're oftentimes limited by space in terms of how much space we have to store the material. Or we may be limited in terms of, you know, agency cash flow in terms of how much we can buy at a time. But within those limits, we want to make sure that we have what we're supposed to have at this point. And then that's what we're going to go to battle with. We do want to really increasingly pay attention to our proper storage limitations. You know, the environmental agencies are going to be increasingly cranking that up on us. And we should calibrate spreaders. I'll come back on that more than once. Again, I hit on that in the last module. If you're you know, sort of new to snow and ice fighting operations and aren't sure, don't have good agency records historically of what you might need in terms of materials, particularly salt for the winter, there are some resources like this from the Salt Institute, but there's others as well that can give you an idea of it. It's very, very general, but if you don't have those specific records of your own, these can be a way to substantiate what your needs are. In buying salt, again, I think probably most agencies lean towards coarser salt because it does give us better penetration usually and lasts a little bit longer on the surface. But we do get a lot more bounce and scatter on that. And we'll talk in module 3 about some techniques that might help us with that. But again, you know, you just want to know this is key to making sure that you get the material that you're after, that you've ordered it properly, and that when it arrives, you've gotten the material that you were looking for. In terms of getting our equipment ready, we might have any of a number of platforms that support plows and spreaders. I mean, obviously trucks, but as you saw in that short video a minute ago, in snow country and really even around here in Delaware and Maryland, it's not unusual to put plows or other types of equipment on backhoes, loaders, motor graders, skid steers, whatever. So whatever it is that we're using, again, we went through that in that planning stage. It's time to make sure that all those are up and running and checked out, so that we don't have any surprises once game day rolls around. We really do want to check those plow supports, go over them carefully, look for any weld cracks and things like that, because if it's, if we see a small weld crack that we can reinforce now, that saves, every year we hear about plows literally falling off trucks somewhere across the country. And that, why deal with that in the middle of a storm? Let's get out ahead of it. So calibrating spreaders, and again, I'll no doubt touch on this again in module 3, but it really is important, as I said in module 1, where we've increasingly got computerized spreader controls, but if we don't really have the right information to feed them about what comes out of the back end of our tailgate spreaders or other types of spreaders that we have, V boxes, whatever, then those computers really can't do anything. We may as well have not spent the money on them. So, and it's not particularly difficult or involved to calibrate spreaders. You can use a calibration chart like this. Again, you can get this from the Snow Fighter's Handbook from the Salt Institute, but there's other places you can get it as well. There are different similar ones. And I think I punted the process to module 3, but it may show back up here. But again, this is how we make the most of those computerized spreader controllers. I think I do have it here. Yeah. So just going through it real quick. There's different ways to do this. We've linked some videos to our Facebook page in the last month or so. If you want to look at it that way. But so there's different ways that you can go at this, but they're all kind of similar. You're going to need some fairly basic equipment, nothing terribly fancy usually. And you're going to load the truck. If you've got a tailgate spreader, you're going to remove the spinner, mark the end of the shaft. On a V-box, you're going to do a little bit differently at each opening of the gate, but that's all. You're going to time the RPMs of the shaft, catch the material from one of those revolutions, weigh that material, and then you fill in the chart. And it's really that straightforward. So it's kind of tedious because you want to do this with each truck and you really want to do it each season. But again, if you don't, then I don't know what all those computerized controls are about. So, and end of rant about that, I suppose. So again, during the preseason, we want to circulate route maps, make sure everybody has theirs, including our contractors, go through holiday vacation schedules. Again, maybe somebody's got an elective surgery scheduled for January. We need to make sure we have that in mind so that we don't, we might have to make some adjustments to the different crews or something like that. Make sure that we're going to, have everything covered with that. Again, that might leave us with certain gaps in equipment or personnel. We can't just tell the storm not to bother us during that time. So we're going to have to make some arrangements. To the extent that we've got time, and very few do, but I get it. If you can take out a little bit of time to look at some of your closed drainage systems, those area, or even open drainage systems. One of the great things about, road crews is that by and large, you get to know your route pretty well. You sort of learn the personality of the road. And so if you've got certain drainage systems, whether they're closed systems or open ditches or things like that, cross culverts, you know where the beaver is likely to have built a nest and blocked up some drainage, or you know, where, you know, a lot of leaf debris can clog up a roadside ditch. And again, if we can get out and do some sort of spot treatments of those things now, and avoid, you know, a situation where water can't get off the road in a large way, then that can save us some headache with snow melt and remelting after storms. Same thing is if you've got certain programs where you put up snow markers, or you've got an adopt a hydrant program, you know, these kinds of things. Again, this is the time of year we want to get those in place. And, you know, if we have things like adopt a hydrant programs where we want to remind those people who are responsible with them, who are probably outside of our agency, of, you know, what their responsibilities are, just in case they've sort of forgotten about it. And so those are just some of the things to think about in terms of preseason prep. There's probably others, particularly some things that might be specific to your agency. But, you know, if you do that and have it out of the way by, you know, Halloween, or at least by Thanksgiving, then you can kind of sit back and know that you're probably pretty well prepared for when you do get the first significant storm. So let's move on from there, from preseason stuff, and talk about game day, our first storm, our seventh storm, whatever it is. You know, what we're going to do when we get some kind of a winter storm that actually hits, now that we're prepared. And so today in this module, we're just really going to focus on plowing issues. And again, on Thursday, I guess it is the next module, that last module, we're going to focus more on the de-icing component. So we'll talk about some of these things here. So again, you know, first storm comes along, our planning's done, our preseason prep is done. You know, we've checked the forecast, and so now it's time to get out there and go at it. So, you know, first things first, we really do want to find out as much as we can about what the storm is. And the more detail we can get about that, the better. We'll touch on some places where you might do that later on. We need to pull the crew together and have a discussion. You know, again, is this a storm? You know, a lot of times we'll know about a storm 2, 3, 4 days in advance nowadays. We'll at least have some idea about it anyway. And so, you know, we could be, you know, a couple days out and have a pretty good idea of what kind of storm is coming our way. And so that's a good time to talk to the crew and say, okay, well, you know, it's expected to start, you know, Thursday night, probably 8, 9, 10 o'clock. So it's going to be after work hours. Here's our plan. Here's what we're going to do. We'll know more Thursday afternoon. We'll update you. But, you know, be prepared accordingly. So remember, in the last module, you know, we talked about, you know, sort of getting the home front ready, right? So this is the time where we say, in a couple of days, we're going to be dealing with this. So make sure you've got the snow shovels out at your house and fuel for the snow blower and all that stuff, so that you don't have to worry about the homestead while you're out taking care of our stuff. You know, we should probably, you know, talk with our elected officials and even the press and the public before each storm, remind them of what kind of expectations they can have of us through levels of service for the storm we're expecting. Again, we might say, look, we talk in terms of levels of service, mostly in terms of snow. We're thinking that this might be a predominantly icing event. And so we want to tell you what's going to be a little bit different about what you can expect from us on this. So it's just a really good idea to sort of manage those expectations now. Absolutely take inventory of things, you know, check the fuel reserves, you know, whether that's, you know, fuels for the equipment or whether that's fuel for the backup generators, all of that stuff. Excuse me. You know, update everybody on the chain of command. It may very well be that the normal chain of command, the public works director, the superintendent of the streets or whatever, is out of town for a few days and isn't going to be there. So who's the second in command that's going to step in and take that role and make sure everybody knows what the chain of command is going to be for this event. Again, that, tailgate meetings to run over safety is an excellent time to go through some of these kinds of issues, right? Particularly if there are things where we have specific kind of expectations for this storm. If it's later in the season, we might expect black ice, for example. That's one that, hey, this could be a curveball that that'll come our way. So, a tailgate safety meeting is an excellent way to sort of do that. Staying up to date through those various kinds of visuals that we talked about in the last module, but also getting, operator reports back. Again, for a lot of us, it's not unusual that the supervisors will be out there before or just as the storm is developing to get a sense of what conditions are on the ground in the various parts of our jurisdiction. We ought to be continually going back to weather reports and monitoring those to see how things are changing or developing, or is the storm developing as we expected, or do we need to make some changes? So when we talk about excuse me, when we talk about plowing, the first thing that comes to mind is just sort of good driving considerations to begin with. A lot of us one way or another go through some kind of defensive driving training. Some of us even regularly, which is great if you get opportunity for that, because it really can reinforce some good practices to make sure that even when you're doing your job well and the other person throws you a curveball, that you're ready for it and sort of have that muscle memory ready to go. We talked about speed management last time. So we should remember and think about what on our routes, the kind of speeds ought to be to sort of balance up what we're trying to accomplish, just as we talked last time. If, we ought to be particularly aware, utility lines and trees are something that, again, we can get lulled into sort of thinking we've got a good handle on, but in particular, when we have, heavy wet snow or icing conditions, those lines can droop or even drop more than they normally would. We can have large tree limbs that are down farther. So we really want to be mindful, certainly if we've got a raised truck bed, even a partially raised truck bed, but even the standard height of our equipment, we want to be mindful of how, the weather conditions themselves have changed some of those potential hazards for us. We've got to be on the lookout for abandoned vehicles. Again, that's part of just our overall situation awareness. And we just don't really have a chance. We don't have the luxury of taking our attention off the road and the surrounding areas for even a second. So certainly distracted driving just really can't be part of what we do. So when it comes to equipment, whether plowing, in any given storm, we're going to have the equipment we have, right? I mean, perhaps we've got a long-term, 3, 4, 5, 7-year plan to improve our equipment. But in the here and now, we have what we have, and there may be even a piece of equipment or two that are down for some reason when this storm rolls around. So we really want to stop and think about, for this particular storm, do we have the right equipment in the right places? Do we need to adjust some plow routes or something like that? We really want to be mindful that bigger is not better. Certainly, you don't want to go into a residential cul-de-sac and, with, a triaxle dump truck, if you can avoid it, because that's going to be a pretty tricky spot to get into and out of. And so that's where something more nimble is going to serve you better. So again, this is part of where we always want to come back, both in terms of what we're doing, but also in terms of how we're communicating with the public. And remember what our priorities are. It's easy enough to sort of forget about this as you're plowing your routes, where you're sort of knocking them all out uniformly, and that's probably fine in our sort of plain vanilla storm. But if we get a particularly significant event, either snow or ice, it may very well be that our priorities drive us back to hitting those primary and secondary routes, and letting some of those tertiary routes go a little bit, because we can't do them all equally well. And so we know that our primaries have to be taken care of. Again, it's, you know, each agency is different, each road network's different. You got to determine your priorities, and then you've also got to be sort of really cognizant of when we ought to change those priorities around a little bit for this given storm. Let's talk about different sort of environments in which we would plow. We'll start from sort of the biggest roads and then work our way down to some of the tighter and quieter streets that we might deal with. And again, depending on what kind of agency you are and what you've got in the way of, you know, what your jurisdiction is and what your routes are like, you may or may not have multi-lane highways. And again, when we think about this, we're thinking of, you know, certainly interstate highways, but, arterial roads that, you know, are going to be multi-lane, multiple lanes in one direction, oftentimes divided highways, things like that. So with that, we have some advantages and disadvantages. I mean, obviously we've got, you know, a lot of real estate to cover, but we probably got a lot of equipment dedicated to it as well, which is nice. We may very well be very open to, you know, crosswinds and things like that. So we may see some drifting and things like that. We may have the advantage of being able to store material in the medians or off of the shoulders. And so there can be some advantages to these multi-lane highways, but there's certainly a big challenge. And this is where, if we're going to use echelon plowing with multiple trucks, or we're going to use tow plows, wing plows, things like that, this is certainly, you know, at least one of the environments in which we're going to use them. If we now step down to sort of a pretty common sort of highway environment where, you know, we've got, you know, two lanes, you know, one in each direction. We may or may not have shoulders to go with it. That depends a lot on where we are. You know, with, you know, most agencies, you know, this is sort of the sweet spot, right? You know, you unless you're a particularly small, you know, sort of municipality, you've probably got at least some of these. So, you know, again, these can be even bigger wind issues in terms of you know, snow drifts and things like that, because of you know, non-existent shoulders and or being very exposed to open fallow fields and things like that. But, you know, so again, here, you know, we're oftentimes probably going to do about 4 passes to get, you know, a lane in each direction. And then, you know, post-storm, we probably will come back and push it back even further if we've got some shoulders to deal with. We can use tandem or echelon plowing in some instances with this, but we really want to be mindful. I mean, there's always, every once in a while, there's that group of plow drivers that, you know, it's 3 a.m. They think they have the roads themselves, and they think, well, we'll run echelon plowing down with including trucks in the wrong direction. That's a really terrible idea, and most agencies' standard operating policies would prohibit that. It's just not worth the risk in most instances. Let's watch this video again. It's fairly brief, but it talks a little bit about those 2-lane roads. Whoops, did that badly.
On your first time out alone, you will probably be assigned to plow 2-lane, 2-way roads. To begin, stay in your own lane. Position the left side of the plow near the center of the road and angle your plow to the right to push the snow off the right-hand side of the road. Always try to uncover the center line on your first pass. Normally, you will also use your light-duty wing as a plow extension to increase your plowing width. If the wind is blowing hard, or if it is especially still and the snow is falling straight down, you may have difficulty from time to time seeing the center line. When you can't see the center line, you may have to revert to using the edge of the road as your guide. Veteran snowplow operators often watch the shoulder for signs of rock or grass if there is not a hard-surfaced shoulder. You can also look for delineators, guardrails, road signs, mailboxes, and other objects that can help give you some idea where the center line is. You can usually feel when the front wheel goes off the road onto the shoulder. If this happens, compensate by carefully steering back towards the center line. When you get to the end of your run, find a safe place to turn around. Once you have made your turn and are ready to head back, position the plow to catch the snow that was left near the center of the road. If you're lucky, you'll be able to see the center line. But many times, the center line is already covered up by the time you head back. Continue making passes until both of the driving lanes are open and have been returned to near normal winter driving conditions, or you are reassigned to a different route.
I will say that these are the old versions of the Iowa DOT videos. The newer ones are much more updated, but even in the newer ones, I will say that, for clarity purposes, they filmed a lot of these after the storm. So you do lose some of the fog of war in there, but I think it's the better part of valor that they're sort of illustrating these a little bit more clearer. But so just some food for thought there on two-way streets. As we move sort of, down the, food chain, if you will, or along the food chain, depending on how you look at it, we get into urban streets, right? So a lot of those roads we were talking about before, we might think of as more urban environments. As we get into the urban environment, some new challenges come into play. And again, we could have multi-lane roads through an urban environment, or all the way down to one-way streets. A lot of times these can be narrow. We might have a parking lane that looks like a shoulder at times, but probably not. We oftentimes will have adjacent sidewalks, sometimes right immediately next to the travel way. Of course, parking. We've got intersections to deal with, and all of these other things that may have been evident to a certain extent in those other road types, but certainly are going to come in with a lot of our urban streets. And so some new challenges come with that. And one of those is, of course, intersections, and we'll just sort of look at this as a admittedly somewhat simplistic look at plowing intersections.
With the main roadway clear, it's time to start cleaning intersections. Here are a couple of ways it can be done. One is to straighten your plow as you enter the intersection. Go on across, moving slightly to the right as you go through the intersection to catch as much snow as possible. Another method is to go through the intersection from every direction, always moving the snow to the right. This method may also require a couple of final passes with the plow straight to clean up any snow that is left in the center of the intersection.
You'll notice in that graphic, just to pick on them a bit, that they have those new six-wheel steering dump trucks that can pivot around a corner. Most of us don't have those. And the reality is that we will run into a little bit, we're gonna leave more snow in that intersection than we show in this kind of a graphic. And that's a cheap shot at them for the illustration for sure. But we should recognize that no matter how you deal with an intersection, you're probably going to have some cleanup work to do, and you really need to be mindful of leaving any kind of a significant windrow in an intersection for any length of time, particularly where you have the potential for it to refreeze and become a real hazard in navigation. And I think this picks up of that concept.
When clearing intersections, make only right-hand turns. To open up the intersection, plow diagonally across, then back up very carefully. Backing up into traffic is a major plowing accident. If the intersection is large, you may have to make a second cut. Turn right, keeping your plow blade on the curb or gutter. This will sweep the rest of the snow to the side. Watch that you keep the rear wheels clear of the windrow. As you see here, running over the windrow pushes snow back into the street and can damage the rear axle.
Yeah, so, you know, the reality is that's easier to say than to do. But, you know, I think just recognizing that you're going to have, these windrows and other kinds of overflows that you can actually pull back in really means that you're going to have to make multiple passes, even when you're in a cleanup mode through an intersection. Continuing in the urban environment, but really any environment like residential subdivisions where we'll see on-street parking, we want to think about where what we're going to do about parking. And, you know, it's not unusual for us to put up emergency snow route signs and along with them put, you know, tow signs and tell people, you know, you're not allowed to park here. And if you do, we're going to tow you. The problem is that a lot of times we don't follow up on that. And as I talked last time, I think that's worse than not doing it all. So what I would argue is be judicious about where you mark emergency snow routes, and particularly where you indicate you're going to tow. And when you do that, actually tow them. It really is just chaos to do otherwise. You know, as we're dealing with areas where we've got parallel, or diagonal parking on the street, you know, there's just not a good way to do it. You might elect to be democratic and push it from one side to the other. There are some, particularly in cities, they'll have alternate side of the street parking, and that can certainly be helpful. And in those instances, to the greatest extent that you can, you know, peel that snow away from the parking aisle, the better, and make use of that alternate side of the street storage area. You know, as you get into a more significant storm and get some buildup, there's just no easy way to deal with on-street parking in most instances. Sidewalks, we talked last time about the idea of, you know, we're in a multimodal environment. We have complete streets policies. We're inviting people to be out walking, biking, et cetera. And increasingly, they're expecting to be able to do that certainly around the same time that motorists are reasonably expecting to be back out on the road. So if the sidewalks fall into our jurisdiction, which increasingly they do sometimes, we've got to have a plan for that. So we really need to make sure that we're out there doing that, or in the absence of it, that, you know, if there's somebody else in charge of it, like adjoining property owners, that the right kind of sort of enforcement is in place to do that. You know, the good news is there are lots of really good techniques and equipment that really even just 15, 20 years ago weren't on the market. Again, our University of Delaware's ground services maintains about 25 miles of pedestrian pathway. And they've just developed over a 20-year period a lot of interesting innovation and approaches born out of necessity, because they don't get to avoid pedestrian pathways at all. At UD, there's no such thing as apparently prioritizing pedestrian pathways. They must all be available all the time under all conditions. That strikes me as a ridiculous policy, but that's apparently students need to be able to go wherever they want, whenever they want. That makes their job pretty tough, but they've come up with some pretty good techniques to do it in most storms. This is the kind of stuff they use. Again, they're converting commercial equipment from use that they use to mow areas over the summer. And, you know, they've got certainly larger equipment as well, but a lot of this gives them a great deal of versatility. You know, again, they've got some larger equipment too, but most of their stuff's pretty small. Cul-de-sacs. So when I was developing this course back in, I think, 2011, the head of City of Newark's Public Works asked me, he said, "Hey, when you're developing that, can you make sure you tell us the secret for cul-de-sacs?" And I said, "You know, can do, Rich. I'll get that for you." And I spent a good part of the summer searching high and low, and I didn't come up with any big magical answers. The problem with cul-de-sacs is that they are, I don't know that there have ever been two built alike. You know, there are so many different kinds. There are some so large you could land Marine One on it, right? Some are so small you can barely navigate a sedan through without a 3-point turn. Some of them have center islands, some don't. Some of them are graded, you know, most of them are graded to the outside, but some grade their drainage to the inside. It goes on and on. And so, you know, what it comes down to is there really isn't a way. It's a way, and it really comes down to coming up with a way for the cul-de-sacs on your route. And the only thing I could say about cul-de-sacs is I think, you know, there's some sort of approaches that have come out of the AASHTO snow guide and things like that, like are shown here. But what I would say is if you find that you are really having to wrestle with your cul-de-sac, ask yourself why that is. And, you know, it may be that the equipment that you have for your route is too big for that cul-de-sac, or conversely, that it's too small, right? If you've got one of these great big, huge open ones, you know, maybe you're just killing yourself getting all that material pushed and you need a bigger truck in there for it. You may also need some kind of ordinance or policy or whatever enforcement. Maybe your biggest problem is that there are people parking in areas where they're not supposed to park in those cul-de-sacs, and maybe you can get some help that way. But what I would say about cul-de-sacs is they're never going to be easy. They're always going to be tough. But ask yourself, what is it that could be done that might make it easier or better? And, you know, that ought to be part of the discussion you have with supervision, and then subsequently maybe with some of the other agencies in the local government, like, you know, planning and zoning, that might have code enforcement people, you know, or even the police department in terms of telling people to get their vehicles out of your way. These are tough enough without people breaking the rules if you think you can change it. So moving on, you know, there's sort of special places, alleys. Most of us don't have these, but when you do, they can be tricky. There's special safety concerns you ought to think about if you've got alleyways that you've got to plow. People may have be storing equipment in there, or, you know, materials, whatever. There may be dumpsters or trash cans. Again, part of your pre-season and pre-storm outreach might be to let those folks know that if they don't want that stuff damaged, they need to make sure it's back where it's supposed to be and out of your way. But it's also, these are the kinds of areas where there's a lot of times there's doors that open out onto the alleys. So taking it slow and careful through these areas is even more, probably more of a necessity than in some of the other areas we deal with. If we have dead end areas, whether, you know, I think of the classic T turnaround that a lot of times you have associated with residential subdivisions. You know, phase 1 has been built, but phase 2 hasn't been built. Well, there's a connector street there, and that T turnaround's been there for the last 30 years. God knows when phase 2 is ever going to be built. One of the problems that comes up with that is a lot of time the beyond the T turnaround is property the agency doesn't own. Maybe that right of way hasn't been obtained yet. And, you know, maybe you've been pushing snow into that area for the last 15 years. And suddenly you go to do it this year and somebody comes running out of a farmhouse and saying, "What are you doing? You're putting snow on my property." And it turns out that, you know, Farmer Johnston, who was fine with that all those years, passed away, and now their kids live there, and they're not keen on that. So it's the kind of thing where you don't want to take it for granted, and to the extent you can get out ahead of that and avoid an argument in the middle of a snowstorm, that could save you some trouble too. If you got bridges to deal with, and most of us do in one fashion or another, you know, we've all seen the sign, apparently bridges freeze before roadways. You know, that can certainly happen in some instances, depending on the environment around it. We should act accordingly all the time and assume that's the case. We also need to think about what's under the bridge. So again, in, you know, my quote snow fighting days, if you will, when I was at Public Works in Cecil County, you know, we had rural roads, and they were with just a couple of exceptions. What was under them was a stream and maybe some cows and goats. That's about what was under there. And cows and goats don't vote, and they don't show up at commissioners meetings, so they don't complain a lot. But most of you probably have bridges that go over other roadways or other areas that you probably want to be a little bit more mindful of. And so, you know, one of the ways, you know, you really want to think about what you're throwing over the side of that. And it's not just that you're throwing over snow and ice, you know, and slush. You don't know what else is in there. There might be a chunk of concrete that's broken off a parapet wall in there that you could also be throwing. So, you know, any kind of road debris could be there, and you don't see it, and you're never going to see it go over the side. So it's just, it's the kind of thing where this is the place where perhaps you slow down a little bit and make sure, be very conscious of how far you're broadcasting material, because if you do get some material like that over the side, you could very well cause a significant vehicle crash or impact a pedestrian or something like that on the area underneath. You really want to think about drainage around bridges, particularly where they are near or at the low point. You want to think about meltwater during the storm, because you know, if you've done a brilliant job of clearing the road, but all of the place where you've pushed back the snow creates a nice funnel to direct that water when it starts melting right onto the bridge deck, then when it refreezes that next night, you could end up with an even bigger problem than you had. So you want to think about ways that you can mitigate that. And I think I touch on that in a later slide a little bit. You know, particularly if we're a more local agency, but any agency can get saddled with various parking lots, whether it's for the library or the town hall or the administration building or whatever. And, you know, again, this is something where, to the extent, you know, we want to be mindful of the storm, and we want to be mindful of what we're hearing, excuse me, from the other parts of our local government unit, whatever that is, right? And so we want to know that, yeah, town hall is going to open up at, you know, at regular time at 7, 8, 9 o'clock, whatever it is. Well, then I really want to, if I can squeeze the personnel and equipment loose, I really want to get in there and knock that parking lot out before they all arrive. Not because I'm a nice guy, but because it's just going to be hellish to try to do it once they start arriving. You know, we want to be mindful of the kinds of things that are unique to that, whether it's light posts or wheel stops or things like that. And we really want to be mindful of where we start piling snow up. We'd like to put it to the downhill side so that the meltwater doesn't create a skating rink in the days that follow. But we want to be also mindful of, well, what's on the other side of that downhill corner. You know, we don't want to create a drainage problem on the neighboring property and have them calling the elected officials and complaining as well. So there's just a lot to think about, and having a good strategy for your parking lots can save you a lot of grief on the back end as well. Here's another one of those quick videos, and this talks about handling and compensation. And again, this is something that in this 26 seconds it's the kind of thing that we can show to a relatively new equipment operator. And those of us that have run plows before, it's kind of intuitive to, but this is not intuitive to them.
Even driving on straight sections of road is like nothing you have ever experienced. The snow really has an effect on how the truck handles. As you push the snow, it is pushing your truck in the opposite direction you are pushing the snow. If you are plowing to the right, the snow will push the truck to the left. When there is a lot of snow on the road, you'll have to oversteer to counteract that force.
So simple concept for most of us, but if you're new to it, that could really take you by surprise. Again, a quick one on visibility.
Visibility is generally an issue when you are plowing snow. If the wind isn't blowing the snow, your plow or other vehicles are kicking it up. Keep your windows as clean as possible so you can see in all directions. If your truck is equipped with heated mirrors, make sure they are turned on. Always keep your windshield wipers clean. And always have your lights on so others can see you. There will be times when you must slow down because of visibility problems or even have to pull off the road in the case of a complete whiteout.
Okay. So sort of continuing on, again, another sort of special circumstance that some agencies will have and others won't. I know in our rural environment in Cecil County, Maryland, we had a lot of blowing and drifting. We had a lot of open farm field in the winter. We oftentimes had roads that were down below the farm fields, 8, 10, 12 feet below grade. And we would have, we were open to the Chesapeake Bay crosswinds, and, it would fill those road gaps in. And so, those are the kinds of things where you sort of keep ahead of those routes, or suffer at the peril of them. Because if they start filling in, if you start getting some big drifting, you can need very different equipment and a lot of time to get it dug back out. So, again, this comes back to knowing the personalities of your routes and knowing, what historically happens in different storm types. So I've alluded to this a couple of times, this idea of controlling meltwater as we're plowing. And there's, we ought to be mindful of it in general, but certainly where we get constrained areas where we've got, curbed streets that, sort of, right up to the travel lanes type thing, or we have rural roads with very little shoulders, that, to the extent they're there, they get built up with grass and sort of create a curb and contain it. Any of those things we ought to be mindful of. But certainly if we get to super elevated curves, again, to the extent that we can, and we've got to balance this with the rest of our plowing strategy, but to the extent that we can plow the bulk of that material to the low side of the road instead of to the upper side of that bank, where as it melts, it just drains down across the road. We'll do ourselves some favors when it comes time for worrying about meltwater and refreezing. Conversely, if you can plow past the shoulder break, if one exists, that's another way to sort of go at that kind of thing. To the extent that we can, not pile material up on storm drains so that water can flow, directly and unimpeded to that. That's great. Where we can, if we've got those kinds of restrained shoulders that are keeping water in the roadway, if we can periodically push some of that material off and sort of create a V notch of sorts for water to escape and get out into the ditch, again, we can do ourselves some real favors. We talked a little bit about, I talked about the T intersections in terms of snow storage, but we can also have the same problems. Again, part of the problem with cul-de-sacs is, we can have a good deal of real estate to clear, and not a whole lot of places to put the snow. It's, you know, not terribly unusual to get a cul-de-sac that has, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 driveway entrances to it, depending on the configuration. And you just got no space between the driveways to sort of drop it. So it really, it can get pretty tricky. And that's why it's important to have a very specific strategy for that cul-de-sac, and maybe experiment around and see what works better than others. Um, you know, again, a little bit of strategy can save you some problems on the back end is sort of the takeaway from that, I think. You know, if we get particularly severe storms, or we get, you know, sort of mid-range storms that are back to back, you know, which, you know, most winters we don't around here, but we certainly did in the winter that preceded, in the winter of 2010, 2011 here. You know, here in the mid-Atlantic, we had twin 22-inch-ish storms, separated by about 5 days, as I recall. It created some real problems. And in a lot of the urban areas, we were doing a lot of loading and hauling out of snow. You know, again, this isn't an every storm kind of thing, thank goodness, because it's expensive, takes a lot of time. We've got to think about where to dispose of that material, because agree, disagree, like it or don't like it. When we're picking up and loading snow into dump trucks, we don't have the luxury of dumping that into any kind of a water body, certainly not directly. Now, a lot of times we'll be allowed to dump that, for example, in a town park, where it may or may not run off into that water body. But I think the expectation is that perhaps the bulk of that would infiltrate. Again, that's for somebody else to make that case, not me. But we really want to be mindful of that and make sure that we're compliant with what the environmental agencies are telling us as well. You know, we have certain expectations for the public when we're plowing the roads, and but we also have to meet those with expectations they have of us. This sort of goes up there with setting the example. And if we as operators have a view of don't do like I say, you know, don't do like I do like I say, we're probably not going to have a lot of credibility with the traveling public. And so we really got to be mindful that we're obeying the traffic laws, and that includes, you know, laws that apply to us about, you know, texting and driving and things like that. We really want to watch our speed, particularly where we know that there may be pedestrians and other sort of sensitive, you know, things in our path. Being very predictable and very visible and not making sudden moves is important. So these are just things that the more conscientious we are and the more predictable and visible we are, probably the better we're going to make out. Certainly we have similar expectations of the traveling public, but you know, and we have things like the move over law in most states, and things like that hopefully people abide by, and hopefully police help enforce a little bit. But again, I would argue that we should be setting the standard by conducting ourselves well. And that could be part of some of your public outreach, is to try to encourage the traveling public, first of all, to stay off the roads and give us a chance to do our jobs. And then when they do come out, to be really mindful of us and others. We talked about speed in module 1. Again, you know, there are different arguments about different speeds. Excuse me. And, you know, there's probably not a one size fits all, but we really, you know, if anybody imagines that faster is necessarily more effective or higher, more productivity, probably wrong, at least in a vacuum. We've got to match our speed to the environment we're plowing in. And, you know, again, we've got to know when that changes along our route. We may be going along and then get to an area where we do have a lot of those mailbox posts or a pedestrian area or something like that, where we ought to, slow it down from where we were doing it to recognize that we've got sort of a slightly different environment. This is actually one of the ones from the new Iowa series, to give you an idea of how they've upgraded it. And this is where they talk about speed a little bit.
A maximum speed of 25 miles per hour has proven to be the most efficient speed for plowing snow. When speed exceeds 25 miles per hour, the plow tends to skip over snow and requires extra trips to clear the leftover snow. Excessive speed can also damage snowplow equipment very easily. Be especially aware of your speed when plowing in town. If you are moving too fast, snow will be thrown off the plow and could possibly damage property. Also, watch for pedestrians who may be in the line of flying snow. Speed should also be adjusted based on driving and wind conditions. You may need to maintain a slower speed to ensure snow is removed from the roadway and does not get blown back onto the roadway after you pass.
So again, that's a little snapshot of the new Iowa videos, and I would point you to them very much. So here's our second of two poll questions for the day. If you can weigh in on this, the right one here. So, what would you say is your typical average plowing speed, or the one that your agency sort of dictates? Give it a second here. I know DRBA's got to walk up to the front of the room. We're almost there. Okay. Well, I'm going to end it there and share that out. So that's interesting. I mean, 15 miles per hour is probably on the lower end of what I typically hear when I ask this question when I'm teaching this course in person. And we hear all different numbers. So, there's no right or wrong, but I increasingly what I do hear, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing that and kick back to this. Increasingly what I do hear when we're in a classroom environment is, between breaks, we get to talking and what have you. And operators and supervisors or what have you will talk in terms of, well, we do 15 here, we do 20 there, we do 25 with this, we do 30 miles per hour there, typically, and we give them some latitude in this range. And what they're telling me is that they're matching it to the environment. And that's the right answer. I don't know that there's a right number on this page so much as, again, thinking about, well, what environment am I plowing in? What is going to be most effective and safest in that environment? That's the speed I should be driving. And some of that just requires some experience and sort of feedback loop over time. So thanks for sharing on that. So again, we've alluded to some of this, but there's stuff beyond the roadway that we want to think about as we're plowing. Particularly in the urban environment, it just stinks, right? Because a lot of times there's the travelway, the curb, and then immediately a sidewalk. Well, it's pretty tough to not cast snow and ice and slush and what have you onto that sidewalk. To the extent that we can, perhaps leave a foot or so of that travelway unplowed to get a little bit farther away, if that helps and if that's tolerable. Maybe that's a technique. But think of it this way: if you were the one that had to come back and clear that sidewalk, would you be plowing the street any differently? And if the answer is yes, then think about how you might do it differently. Curb ramps historically have been a real problem, even in locales where We do a pretty good job of clearing the sidewalks. The curb ramps have, you know, oftentimes been left as demilitarized zones where nobody seems to own them. The reality is that somebody better start owning them, because we're going to start seeing litigation and things like that associated with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We just can't have hours, and certainly not days after the storm, to have a kind of curb ramp like you see in this lower left photo. We're going to have a better approach. That may not mean it's you to do, but you ought to be part of the conversation and the discussion as to who is responsible and what the expectations are. Mailboxes are a tricky area, particularly in the environment or the rural environment. There are policies that are all over the place with mailboxes. Some agencies will never acknowledge that they hit a mailbox. They'll go to their grave swearing they didn't. There's others that if somebody calls and says they did, they just don't bat an eye and get them a new mailbox, and there's everything in between, right? You know, the reality is that you're going to have some sidewalks that sort of look like the Saturday Evening Post picture there, that, you know, are barely kind of hanging on, you know, through the summer and aren't really ready for any cascading snow. You know, again, some outreach in the beginning of the season to say, look, you know, your mailbox doesn't look like it's going to make it through the winter, by the way. You might want to get out there and take care of it, because it's not going to be our top priority during the storm, or even immediately after. You know, if we have sensitive roadside features, you know, again, the more mechanical things like fire hydrants that we talked about before, but, you know, if it's brought to our attention that we have certain decorative plants or, you know, sensitive species or things like that, that we have to be mindful about piling snow up on or around, or, you know, and later when we talk about de-icing materials, you know, we ought to modify our strategy around those areas accordingly. And again, you know, our first priority is safety and mobility of the public, you know, getting those primary routes cleared, and making sure that the other things like hydrants and things are taken care of. Again, you know, through the plowing operation, if we've got a snow emergency route and we said we were going to tow and there's vehicles there, you know, I really think as an agency, we need to have a policy that says the operator is to call in and say, hey, I've got a car, come get it towed. I don't know why we bother putting the signs up if we're not going to do it. So, you know, as the storm, you know, particularly a significant storm continues, you may find that this goes on for a couple of days where you're dealing with it, right? Or certainly over the course of 10, 12, 15 hours, you know, partway through, you might take time to brief the stakeholders again. You know, you got elected officials that get a little antsy. They're getting phone calls from people. Get out and sort of cut them off at the pass and steal their thunder a bit. And give them a briefing. Here's where we are. Here's the kind of problems we're having. Here's what we've heard about the storm. Here's how we're changing gears, and sort of encourage folks to continue to sort of have your back as you're trying to do it. And, you know, and talk to the outside world. Again, this is a great time to remind people about sidewalks and curb ramps and things like that. So like I said, you know, that's what we're going to talk about in terms of game day, the salt, sands, you know, de-icing materials. We're going to cover that in module 3. But for now, we're going to switch gears, and we're sort of in the home stretch here. We're probably going to wrap up a little bit early here. And we're just going to talk about the kinds of things that you ought to be thinking about after each storm. You know, next time we're going to wrap module 3 up, talking a little bit about post-season activities and some of the different kinds of things we might want to do at the end of the season. But for now, you know, these are the kinds of things that you at least ought to be mindful of, and probably want to do most of these between each storm. So, you know, the first thing is, you know, once you've gotten to the point where the storm's over and you've sort of gotten things to your level of service that you promised people, then probably everybody's worn out. And that's a good time to call it a day or a night or whatever and go home and get some rest, and come back to do the cleanup rather than just continuing to plow on, unless it was a relatively small event and you can do that. That's great. This is a great time in the couple of days after the storm, get out a press release, letter the editor, whatever. And this is one of those ones where, you know, again, I can feel the eyes rolling a little bit, but I'm going to argue to you that this is too easy to do to not try, right? So even if a lot of people were out on the roads during the storm and were in your way and whatever, look past it and pretend they didn't. Pretend that everybody were good boys and girls, stayed off the roads. Write a letter to the editor that says, hey, we really appreciate all you folks that, you know, stayed off the roads, let us get our job done. It really made a big difference for us, and it helps us help you not only do it quicker, but also do a better job at it and save some taxpayer dollars. For the ones who did, they're going to appreciate being thanked. For the ones who didn't, well, some of them, you might get to think, oh, yeah, I was kind of a jerk because I got out there, right? Maybe you'll change their view, just a few of them. Point is it's a quick letter. Why not shoot it off, right? Bottom line is that the back end of a storm is where you manage, you know, the public and win some hearts and minds as well. And it's the cheapest thing you're going to do in winter maintenance operations. So the cleanup stuff is, again, the stuff beyond your levels of service. And if it was a relatively light event, you can, you know, sort of hang out for another, you know, few hours and get this knocked out. Well, that's great. Go ahead and do it. But otherwise, this is the stuff that happens the next day or so, where you can come back a little bit rested, but, you know, we're going to want to do some cleanup work. And so, you know, one of those is pushing back some shoulders. We may have some areas of sidewalk or other places where it blew back in. And so, again, we're thinking in terms of, you know, now we're trying to further control meltwater. We want to plan for refreezing that might occur. We might be thinking about the next, you know, 4 or 5 inch storm, snowstorm that's supposed to come in 4 or 5 days. And so we want to get out ahead of it, make sure that we've got some place to push the next material. Again, dressing up parking lots to the extent that we didn't get that taken care of already. Go around and check hydrants, or, you know, put a bug in the ear of those who are supposed to do that. Make sure that they're cleared out, because the last thing you don't want to lose even 5 or 6 minutes where firemen are trying to find and dig out a hydrant in a more significant snowstorm or in the aftermath of it. That could literally mean the difference between life and death. We want to have an eye towards those areas again, whether it's, you know, curb ramps that haven't been cleared yet, or we've got some refreezing like you see on the left pictures on the left. You know, these are areas that we, you know, either want to try to go back and get some de-icing materials on, or in the case of the center picture there, we might even just barricade that area off if we can't deal with it right now. But leaving it unattended is probably a poor idea. We want to maintain the equipment. And again, this is something where we want to be mindful of what the environmental agencies tell us, because increasingly they do not want this done in an uncontrolled environment. They want it in a wash bay or something like that. But it's really important, if we want our equipment to last over the long term, we've got to get those corrosive chemicals off of the equipment. And, you know, we don't necessarily need to get in every nook and cranny between storms, although if we have the opportunity to do a good thorough one, that's great. But we certainly want to give it a good once over between storms if we can. You know, again, if you've got the luxury of a wash bay like this, and high pressure washes and high volume hoses and things like that, you're going to do much better. While you're doing this, have a real eye towards the safety equipment on the truck. Look for safety lights that might have been knocked out or aren't working. You know, pay attention around the plow and make sure that you didn't develop a new crack in the connection points. Take advantage of the fact that you're walking around the equipment anyway. And this just a quick summary of some of those things.
Once a storm is over and the roads are open and clear, get the equipment cleaned up as soon as possible so you are ready for the next snowfall. After you have emptied any material left on your truck and put it back in the stockpile, wash the truck, making sure to get all of the salt thoroughly washed off, as well as sand and dirt. Again, check all blades, plow, wing, and ice blade, making certain there is at least 2 inches of blade extending beyond the moldboard. Also, check skid shoes for excessive wear if you have them on your wing. Look over all equipment and check for cracks in welds or any missing parts. Point out any problems to your shop mechanic. And as you do every time before you head out of the shop, do another walk around of the truck, checking tires, lights, and wipers so repairs can be completed and you will be prepared for the next run without delays.
So, excuse me, again, depending on where you are in the season in this, post-storm sort of scenario, take a look at what your material reserves are, particularly as you get later in the season. Maybe you had a nice, substantial stockpile of de-icing materials that you thought would last you the whole winter. Particularly as you get farther into the season, make sure that you sort of, tidy those piles back up, get a good sense of where you are with it, and see if, in fact, you've got enough to make the distance, and get out ahead of it so that in those last storms, which, might turn out to be some of the worst storms you see all year, you don't run short. So having a look at those is a good idea. The other, I don't know that I mentioned it, but again, they alluded to it in that quick video. Also have a look at, other sort of equipment supplies. Do you have, did you bolt on the last cutting edge in this storm that we just did? If so, you want to make sure that you're sort of replenishing that supply as well. Again, we want to be mindful of meltwater control. Hopefully we've done a good job as we plowed to make sure we didn't sort of create unnecessary meltwater issues. But, in an area like this lower left where we've got, you see the meltwater coming down across that sloping road, probably we did all we could do there, during the plowing, but we're going to have some of that flow across there. So, we may very well want to go back in and, depending on what the weather forecasts are for temperatures, put some de-icing materials on those to make sure that we're not going to have a problem when refreezing occurs. If we've got areas like this, and increasingly we're going to see them, again, this comes back to that multimodal concept. If this kind of an area, or these kinds of areas are our jurisdiction, and they may be if they're around, a town park or town amenity or whatever, they're going to be rolling through here, and then this slushy material is going to freeze, and then the next batch is going to be through here, and they're going to take a fall. They may injure themselves, and they're going to allege that you owed them a certain duty to have that area cleared. So, either barricade it off temporarily, or, get in there with, a rubber cutting edge and squeegee that stuff off, or get some de-icing materials down, or a collection of those strategies. But leaving it untreated probably is a poor idea. Along the lines of meltwater control, we want to deal with these, but also if you look at this, if this snow pile on the left is an area near an intersection, we may very well have plowed up snow, or others have plowed up snow to where there's limited sight distances coming out of intersections, or significant commercial entrances, or entrances to the town hall, or things like that. So in the couple days after the storm, you might want to be on the lookout for areas like this and see if you can't knock those piles down a little bit and reestablish those lines of sight. Again, if we're having to load things out and do that, that's fine. But again, we really would like to be mindful that we don't create a drainage problem on an adjoiner's piece of property that, you know, could have been avoided, because again, we're just going to end up with an argument with a local resident that, you know, perhaps we could have avoided. If we have safety features that have been knocked down, you know, during the storm, then we probably want to get back in there and, you know, and deal with them, you know, even on an interim basis. And I mean, so certainly something like a stop sign or an impact attenuator on at the end of a guardrail or something like that. You know, if we have, you know, if we have a no littering sign, that can probably wait, and we'll deal with that in the spring, if ever. But you know, where whatever damage has occurred could, you know, create a real near-term safety issue. We probably ought to get in there in the hours or days after the storm and do at least an interim repair to those. If we are in one of those more significant events where you know, after the storm's over, we have to do haul out, we really want to be mindful of, again, not only where we take that material, but you know, how we load it out. Because again, you know, as much as we want to argue about the you know, the residents staying off the roads during the storm, once the storm's over, they have a reasonable expectation that they should be able to be out and about, right? So if we have an area like this where we're loading out, you know, from the street, pedestrians are going to be on the sidewalks. They're going to be crossing streets in areas where we might be, and they're not going to be unreasonable to be there. So, you know, we really can't have a beef with them at that point. And so if you're going to be doing a loadout operation, you might very well want to consider at that point to have some kind of an on-the-ground spotter to be on the lookout to make sure that we're not putting anybody in danger. Again, with bridges and things like that, we want to go through in the day or so after the storm and see if we've got any problem areas that we can do some quick work for. An example like the one on the right is a good one I was alluding to earlier. If we could go in there, if the only difference between water going down across that bridge as it melts versus off and to the right or off to the left and down into the stream is us slowly taking that plow blade and nudging off a V in it to get it to drain there, or, you know, running a backhoe or a loader up there to do the same kind of thing. If we're able to do that, that again can save us some problems with a refreezing issue. You know, in the days after the storm, you know, even the hours after the storm, there could be utility groups that are out there, you know, doing repairs to lines or cutting trees that have gone over on lines, things like that. You know, we may need to do some temporary cold patch repairs and things like that. So one of the things we're going to be really mindful of is we probably are going to need some temporary traffic controls. And we want to make sure that we're doing all that stuff very, very safely. Finally, I would argue that even if it's, you know, just a few minutes, pull the crew together, close the doors, don't let anybody else in. It's just you chickens, and do a quick debrief. Where are we? Did we break anything? Did we have a particular problem out of a resident? Did we have an elected official that was sort of interfering with the chain of command that somebody, you know, maybe could have a little chat with about? You know, maybe we've got some hurt feelings we need to do some apologies for. That's fine. But it's just an opportunity to sort of catch everybody up and make sure that if we have any action items before the next storm, we can go ahead and get started on those. And that's all I have, because now I reveal who the band was. So that tells me I'm at the end. And so if you haven't checked them out, you should check them out. So that's all I have today on this module. And as promised, it went a little faster than the last one, and we wrapped up a little bit early. But that's all that we have for now. You know, I know I sort of went through that, and I didn't do the normal sort of stop and ask for comments. I figured you'd interrupt me if you had something. But any questions or thoughts on that stuff thus far, or stuff in the chat box that we ought to talk about before we go?
Matt, one thing in the chat box is the link for the YouTube channel for the Iowa DOTs. Isn't that on the slides?
It is on the slides, and so and I don't have it handy, but I'll try to remember
Hold
3 to drop it in the chat box as well.
Let me see if I can find it quick.
Yeah. So if we don't find that real quick before we close this out, we'll try to do that and do that. I see something there in the chat box. Yeah. I you know, Sarah, I skipped over or skipped past that point pretty quickly, but you're right. Increasingly, you know, we're real mindful of that excess material. You know, if we do a good job of putting materials down, it'll be pretty minimized. But even when we're really good at what we're doing in terms of control of sand or salt, you know, when we tip that truck bed to adjust the load or things like that, we can get a little bit of overspill. So, you know, even when we really do a nice job of controlling it, we can have localized areas where we have that. And you're right, that material can stay there, particularly, and we'll talk about it next time a little bit when we're talking about de-icing materials, depending on kind of de-icing chlorides you're using. If you have a residue left on the pavement, you can actually create ice by drawing moisture out of the environment. So I'll leave that as a teaser for module 3 of something that we might want to be mindful of. That's not something that comes with our typical rock salt, but so all the more reason why we really want to sort of increasingly up our game in terms of managing our materials and using only that which is necessary to meet our levels of service. So good point there, Sarah. Anything else that I missed in the chat box? I don't see anything else there. You guys see? Any other questions or comments or?
Nope, that was it.
Well, then I won't belabor the point. I'll let you guys go a few minutes early. Thanks for bearing with me today. And hopefully we'll see you with module 3 and we'll round that out with, again, a pretty strong focus on, you know, de-icing materials. So thanks a lot. Be safe and we'll see you for module 3. Take care.